The furnace glowed orange in the November darkness. It was 1995, and the men gathered on the shop floor knew they were witnessing something that would never happen again. Not here. Not in this building, where their fathers and grandfathers had worked. Not in this city that had been synonymous with American steel for nearly 140 years. The molten metal poured into the mold, white-hot and impossibly bright, the way it had poured millions of times before. But this time was different. This was the last heat of steel that would ever be made at the Bethlehem plant. The furnace that had fed the Golden Gate Bridge, that had armed the ships that won 2 world wars, that had raised the skyline of New York City toward the clouds, was going dark. A union leader named Jerry Green stood watching. He had worked at the plant for 27 years. His father had worked there before him. When a reporter asked him what he was thinking, Green said something that captured the whole tragedy of what was happening. "I never would have believed it in my wildest dreams," he said. "I thought Bethlehem was a giant and steel was king. Steel had been king. Bethlehem Steel had been a giant. At its peak, this company employed 300,000 Americans. It produced nearly a quarter of all the armor plate that protected American warships. It built over 1,100 vessels during World War II alone, more than any other shipbuilder in the country. Its structural beams held up 80% of the New York skyline, the Empire State Building, Rockefeller Center, the Waldorf Astoria, the George Washington Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge, Alcatraz. The company's chief engineer had once boasted, without exaggeration, that Bethlehem Steel owned New York. And now it was over. The blast furnaces would go cold. The rolling mills would fall silent. The 23,000 workers who had still been coming through the gates would scatter to whatever jobs they could find, if they could find any at all. The children of steelworkers would not become steelworkers. A way of life that had sustained this community for generations was ending, and nothing would replace it. Here is the question that haunts this story. How does a company that literally built America fail to build a future for itself? How does the corporation that armed the arsenal of democracy become unable to compete with minimills in South Carolina and rebuilt factories in Japan? How does an enterprise that once received a $100 million buyout offer from the Kaiser of Germany end up selling its carcass for a fraction of that value 80 years later? The answers are not simple, and they are not comfortable. This is a story of visionary founders and complacent heirs, of technology ignored and competition dismissed, of pension promises that seemed affordable when steel was king and proved fatal when steel was not, of executives who rode private elevators in splendid isolation while the world changed beneath them. But before we can understand how Bethlehem Steel died, we need to understand how it lived. We need to go back to the beginning, to a small ironworks on the Lehigh River, to the eve of the Civil War, to a time when America was about to be forged in fire and blood and steel. One more thing. If you visit Bethlehem, Pennsylvania today, you can still see the blast furnaces. They tower over a 10-acre campus that now hosts outdoor concerts and arts festivals. Visitors walk along elevated trestles that once carried ore to the furnaces. They take photographs in front of rusting industrial cathedrals that have been preserved as monuments to what once was. And just beyond the blast furnaces, you will find a casino. The Sands Casino Resort Bethlehem opened in 2009 on land where steelworkers once poured the metal that built the American century. The developers faced an ironic problem during construction. There was a global steel shortage at the time. They had difficulty finding the 16,000 tons of structural steel they needed to build a $600 million casino on the grounds of what had been America's second largest steel producer. They had to import the steel. From the Golden Gate Bridge to the ships that won World War II, Bethlehem Steel didn't just build structures, it built a way of life that is now gone. This episode is dedicated to uncovering how that happened. If you're still watching, please like this video and subscribe to support the channel where we investigate the titans that built the world and the hubris that brought them down. Did you know someone who worked in the trades or mills? I'd love to hear their story in the comments below. Now, let's begin. The idea for an ironworks in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, came from a man named Augustus Wola in 1857. Wola saw what others saw. The Lehigh Valley sat at the junction of 2 railroads. The Lehigh River provided water power. Anthracite coal from nearby mines could fuel the furnaces. It seemed like an obvious place to make iron. Vole called his venture the Salcona Iron Company. He gathered investors. He drew up plans. And then, before he could break ground, the panic of 1857 swept through the American economy. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. The price of iron ore cratered. Vola's investors scattered. The Salcona Iron Company existed only on paper, and even that paper was worth nothing. This was the same year that the Supreme Court handed down the Dred Scott decision, ruling that Black Americans could never be citizens. The nation was tearing itself apart over slavery. Within 4 years, the Civil War would begin. Augustus Vola's failed iron company seemed like a minor footnote to history, if it was a footnote at all. But the idea did not die. When the economy recovered in 1859, a new group of investors reorganized the venture, moved the site to South Bethlehem, and changed the name to the Bethlehem Rolling Mill and Iron Company. The driving force behind this resurrection was Asa Packer, president of the Lehigh Valley Railroad. Packer needed rails for his railroad. He was tired of paying high prices for imported iron rails and dealing with unreliable suppliers. He wanted a captive source, and he was willing to fund one. Packer's second-in-command, a railroad engineer named Robert Sayre, was tasked with making it happen. Sayre knew they needed more than money. They needed technical expertise. They needed someone who understood how to build blast furnaces and rolling mills, someone who had done it before and done it well. In 1860, Sayre found his man. John Fritz stepped off a train in Bethlehem on July 5, 1860, with his wife and young daughter. He was 40 years old, already recognized as one of the finest iron masters in America. At the Cambria Iron Works in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, Fritz had patented something called the three-high rail mill. This was a revolutionary system for producing strong, durable rails more efficiently than anyone else could manage. Sayre offered Fritz $5,000 a year and 40 shares of company stock to bring his expertise to Bethlehem. Fritz accepted. The timing could not have been worse. Within a year, the Civil War erupted. Lincoln called for troops. The nation mobilized for war. And John Fritz found himself trying to build an ironworks while the country burned. The challenges were immense. Skilled workers were scarce because so many had enlisted or been drafted. Materials were difficult to obtain because the war consumed everything. Fritz had to design and construct blast furnaces, rolling mills, and machine shops. From scratch, in a small Pennsylvania town, while a civil war raged and supply chains collapsed. Construction of the first blast furnace began on July 1, 1861. It would take 18 months to complete. Fritz supervised every detail. He solved problems that had no precedence. He improvised when materials failed to arrive. He drove his workers relentlessly, not because he was cruel, but because he understood that the window of opportunity might close if they did not move fast. On January 4, 1863, the first blast furnace at Bethlehem Iron roared to life. It was the same month that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. By September of that year, the rolling mill was operational, and Bethlehem Iron shipped its first railroad rails. They were good rails, strong and true, the product of Fritz's patents and Fritz's obsessive attention to quality. Asa Packer finally had his captive iron supplier. Think about what John Fritz accomplished. He arrived in Bethlehem with nothing but his knowledge and his reputation. Within 3 years, in the middle of a civil war, he had built an industrial enterprise from bare ground. He had proven that his three-high mill could work outside of Johnstown. He had established a foundation that would last for nearly 140 years. But Fritz was not content to make railroad rails forever. He understood something that would prove essential to Bethlehem's survival. Markets change, technologies evolve. A company that does only one thing will eventually find itself doing nothing at all. In 1873, Fritz oversaw the transition from iron to steel. New production techniques, imported from England, allowed Bethlehem to manufacture the harder, more durable metal. Steel rails were superior to iron rails. They lasted longer, carried heavier loads, and commanded premium prices. Fritz's company adapted. By 1875, Bethlehem Iron was primarily a steel producer. Even though it still carried the word iron in its name, the rail business boomed through the 1870s and into the 1880s. But by the middle of that decade, the market had changed again. Too many companies were making steel rails, prices fell, margins shrank. Fritz watched his competitors struggle and understood that Bethlehem needed to find a new product, a new market, something that would set them apart. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction. The United States Navy, which had been neglected since the Civil War, was finally being rebuilt and modernized. Congress authorized new warships. Those warships needed armor plate to protect them from enemy shells. They needed heavy gun forgings to arm them for battle. The contracts were enormous, and only a handful of American companies had the capability to compete for them. In 1887, Bethlehem Iron won a $4 million contract from the Navy to produce armor plate and gun forgings. This was a bet-the-company moment. The technology required was completely different from rail production. Fritz would have to build America's first heavy forging plant. He would have to acquire licenses for foreign armor-making processes. He would have to hire specialists and train workers in techniques that no American company had ever mastered. The construction of the heavy forging plant took from 1888 to 1892. Fritz and his assistant, Russell Wheeler Davenport, designed enormous forging presses capable of shaping armor plate. They built machine shops to produce the huge guns that would arm battleships. They created, essentially from nothing, the birthplace of the modern American defense industry. By the late 1890s, Bethlehem's armor plate and gun forgings had completely revitalized the American fleet. When the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, American warships carried Bethlehem armor and Bethlehem guns. The victory at Manila Bay, the destruction of the Spanish fleet at Santiago, these triumphs were enabled by the industrial capacity that John Fritz had built in a small Pennsylvania town. Fritz retired in 1892, having transformed Bethlehem Iron from a modest railmaker into a major defense contractor. He lived until 1913, long enough to see the company grow beyond anything he could have imagined, long enough to see it renamed Bethlehem Steel, long enough to see it fall into the hands of a man who would make it an empire. Charles Michael Schwab was born in Williamsburg, Pennsylvania in 1862, the son of a blanket manufacturer who operated a livery stable. He grew up in Loretto, a small town in the Allegheny Mountains, and he left school after graduating from St. Francis College to seek his fortune. He founded in Andrew Carnegie's steel mills. Schwab started as a stake driver at the Edgar Thomson Steel Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania. It was the lowest job in the mill, literally pounding stakes into the ground to mark surveying points. He earned $1 a day. He was 17 years old. Within 6 months, he had impressed his supervisors enough to be promoted. Within 2 years, he was assistant manager of the entire plant. By the time he was 35, Charles Schwab was president of the Carnegie Steel Company, the largest steel producer in the world. How did a stake driver rise so far so fast? Those who knew Schwab used words like charm and genius and hustle. Thomas Edison, who met Schwab later in life, called him the master hustler. Schwab had an extraordinary ability to make people like him. He remembered names, he told stories. He made whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person in the room. These skills served him well in the cutthroat world of industrial capitalism. In 1901, Schwab played a pivotal role in one of the largest business deals in American history. He served as the intermediary between Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan in the creation of United States Steel Corporation. The deal consolidated Carnegie Steel with several other major producers into a single company worth over $1 billion, the first billion-dollar corporation in history. Schwab became U.S. Steel's first president. It should have been the pinnacle of his career. Instead, it was a disaster. Schwab's freewheeling management style clashed with Morgan's more conservative approach. Schwab liked to make deals on handshakes. Morgan's people wanted everything documented and approved by committee. Schwab wanted to run the company his way. Morgan's board wanted to run it their way. The breaking point came when newspapers reported that Schwab had been spotted gambling at Monte Carlo. The scandal embarrassed Morgan and infuriated the board. Schwab's personal behavior, they felt, reflected poorly on the corporation. In 1903, after 2 years of clashes and conflicts, Schwab resigned from U.S. Steel. He was 41 years old, enormously wealthy, and suddenly without a company to run. Most men in his position would have retired. Schwab had enough money to live lavishly for the rest of his life. But retirement was unthinkable to a man whose identity was built on work. He needed a company, he needed something to build. He found it in Bethlehem. While still at U.S. Steel, Schwab had purchased a controlling interest in the Bethlehem Steel Company as a personal investment. The company was small compared to Carnegie, Steel producing annual profits of about $1.4 million against U.S. Steel's profits of $70 to $100 million, but Schwab saw potential. Bethlehem had the Navy contracts. Bethlehem had the heavy forging capability. Bethlehem had a reputation for quality that could be leveraged into something much bigger. In 1904, Schwab reorganized his holdings into a new entity called Bethlehem Steel Corporation. The company included the South Bethlehem plant, iron ore mines in Cuba, and shipyards on both coasts. Schwab became president and chairman of the board. He was finally free to run a company exactly as he wanted, with no board of directors second-guessing his decisions. No J.P. Morgan looking over his shoulder. Schwab moved from New York to Bethlehem to take direct control of operations. He walked the shop floors, he talked to workers, he studied the production processes, and he identified an opportunity that would transform not just his company, but the entire construction industry. In 1905, Schwab toured a steel mill in Luxembourg and saw something remarkable. The mill was producing a new type of structural beam using a process invented by an English engineer named Henry Gray. The beam had a wide flange, shaped like the letter H, that could be rolled in a single section rather than fabricated from multiple pieces. This made it stronger, lighter, and cheaper than anything else on the market. Schwab immediately understood the implications. Buildings were getting taller. Architects were designing structures that required ever more steel. The old fabricated sections were expensive and labor-intensive to produce. If Bethlehem could master the Gray process and produce wide flange beams at scale, they would have a product that no competitor could match. The gamble was enormous. Schwab would have to license the technology from Gray, build an entirely new mill, train workers in unfamiliar techniques, and produce a product whose market acceptance was unproven. The cost would be $5 million, a staggering sum that represented years of profits. If the Gray mill failed, it might take the company down with it. Schwab bet the company anyway. Construction of the Gray mill began in 1906. A young electrical engineer named Eugene Grace was assigned to supervise the project. Grace had joined Bethlehem as a crane operator after graduating from Lehigh University as class valedictorian. He had turned down a contract to play professional baseball for the Boston Braves, calculating that a career as a shortstop would end by 35, while a career in steel had no ceiling. He was 29 years old, and Schwab saw something in him that reminded Schwab of himself. The Gray mill began production in 1908. The first wide flange beams rolled out and met every specification. Architects loved them. Construction companies loved them. Within a few years, Bethlehem Steel's H-beams were enabling a revolution in building design. The age of the skyscraper had begun, and Bethlehem Steel would supply the bones. But Schwab's success came at a cost that would echo through the company's history. In February of 1910, workers at the Bethlehem plant went on strike. The grievances were simple and serious. Unskilled laborers earned 12 cents an hour. Skilled workers earned perhaps twice that. But they were trapped in a bonus system that forced them to work enormous overtime just to earn a living wage. 97% of the workforce worked at least 10 hours a day. More than half worked 12 hours or more. 29% worked 7 days a week with no extra pay for Sundays. In 1909 alone, 21 workers had died on the job, and over 900 had been seriously injured. The workers wanted Sundays off. They wanted higher wages. They wanted the right to organize a union. Schwab refused to negotiate. "I will not be in the position of having management dictated to by labor," he declared. 9,000 workers walked out. The strike lasted 108 days. On February 26th, Schwab called in the newly formed Pennsylvania State Police. Troopers arrived in South Bethlehem and clashed with crowds of strikers and onlookers. There were beatings, there was chaos, and there was a death. Joseph Sambo was a 37-year-old Hungarian immigrant. He worked at the steel plant, but on that February night, he was not on the picket line. His wife was in labor with their fourth child, and she had stomach pains. Zambo went to the Majestic Hotel, where strikers had been meeting, to buy wine to soothe her. The state police pursued a rowdy crowd to the hotel. Accounts differ on exactly what happened next. Either a trooper fired a warning shot, or a trooper was hit by us. Rock and a fellow officer opened fire. A bullet came through the hotel window and struck Joseph Sambo. He died that night. His wife gave birth to their fourth child without him. The strike ended in early May without the workers winning any of their demands. Schwab allowed them to return to their jobs, but made no changes to wages, hours, or working conditions. The union organizing effort collapsed. It would be another 31 years before Bethlehem steel workers successfully unionized. President William Howard Taft sent federal investigators to examine conditions at the plant. Their report confirmed everything the workers had claimed: the poverty wages, the brutal hours, the dangerous conditions. The report made national news and fueled the growing debate over labor rights and industrial power. But it changed nothing at Bethlehem Steel. Schwab moved on. He launched what he called welfare capitalism, creating a company band, company athletic teams, company social programs designed to win worker loyalty without giving workers any actual power. He built row houses in South Bethlehem to ease the housing shortage. He presented himself as a benevolent employer while maintaining absolute control over every aspect of his workers' lives. And in 1914, while Schwab was perfecting his paternalistic empire, the world exploded into war. The guns of August 1914 changed everything. Within weeks of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Europe was at war. Germany invaded Belgium, France mobilized, Britain declared war, and the combatants discovered that they needed far more weapons, far more ammunition, far more steel than any of them had stockpiled. Bethlehem Steel was ready. The company had spent years building its capacity to produce guns, armor plate, and munitions. Now, there were buyers with unlimited budgets and desperate needs. The Allies, especially Britain and France, could not produce enough weapons domestically. They turned to neutral America, and in neutral America, they turned to Charles Schwab. Schwab was not shy about the opportunity. He traveled to Europe repeatedly, meeting with British and French officials, negotiating contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. In 1915, Bethlehem Steel received a $135 million order from Britain, the largest single contract in the company's history to that point. The order was for artillery shells, gun forgings, armor plate, and everything else an industrial war required. There was a problem. The United States was officially neutral. American companies were not supposed to be arming one side of a European conflict. Schwab solved this by routing shipments through Canada. The munitions would be manufactured in Bethlehem, shipped north across the border, and then sent to Britain as Canadian exports. It was technically legal, if ethically questionable. Schwab did not particularly care. He was in the business of making steel and making money, and the war was providing unlimited opportunities for both. The scale of production that Bethlehem achieved between 1914 and 1918 defies easy comprehension. The company produced 60% of all the finished guns ordered by the United States military. It produced 40% of all American artillery shells. It produced 65% of all the artillery pieces manufactured by all the Allied nations combined. For Britain and France alone, Bethlehem delivered 20 million artillery rounds, 70 million pounds of armor plate, and 1.1 billion pounds of steel for shells. How did they do it? How does a single company produce that much material that fast? The answer involved money, manpower, and relentless expansion. Schwab poured over $102 million into new buildings at the Bethlehem plant. The workforce swelled from 24,500 to 31,000 employees. Women were hired in significant numbers for the first time. The plant operated around the clock, day and night, 7 days a week. Workers who had struck for Sundays off just 5 years earlier now worked those Sundays willingly. Caught up in the patriotic fervor of the war effort, the profits were staggering. Bethlehem Steel's stock price rose from $8 per share in 1907 to $30 in 1913 to $600 in 1915 to a peak of $700 in 1916. Charles Schwab, who had been merely wealthy when he took over the company, became one of the richest men in America. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II recognized what Bethlehem Steel was doing to his war effort. He made Schwab an extraordinary offer: $100 million to buy the company and remove it from the Allied supply chain. Schwab refused. Britain's government, hoping to guarantee Bethlehem's continued support, made a counteroffer of $150 million. Schwab refused that too, pledging to honor his commitments to the Allies without selling out. Remember that number, $100 million from the Kaiser in 1915. We will return to it. When America entered the war in April 1917, Schwab's efforts intensified. In April 1918, President Woodrow Wilson personally asked Schwab to take over the Emergency Fleet Corporation, a government agency charged with building merchant ships to transport troops and supplies to Europe. Schwab agreed. He reorganized the agency's contracting system, replacing cost-plus arrangements with fixed-price contracts that incentivized efficiency. American shipbuilding capacity exploded. The armistice came on November 11, 1918. By that date, Bethlehem Steel had armed the Allied victory. The company that had started as a small ironworks making railroad rails had become, in the words of one historian, the most important to America's national defense of any company in the past century. Schwab returned from the war as a national hero, but he was also being called something less flattering. Critics labeled him, and other munitions makers, merchants of death, profiteers who had grown rich on the blood of millions. Congressional investigations would follow. Books would be written. The reputation of the armaments industry would never fully recover from the charge that they had encouraged war for profit. Schwab didn't care much about the criticism. He had a company to grow and more money than he could ever spend. He built a 75-room mansion on Riverside Drive in New York, the most ambitious private house ever constructed in the city. The $7 million palace featured a Roman bath, a bowling alley, a grand court with 2 levels of balconies, and gardens with a 4-car garage and service tunnels. It occupied an entire city block on the Upper West Side, which was then considered the wrong side of Central Park. Schwab was trying to make it the right side. Meanwhile, Eugene Grace was running the company. Schwab had promoted his protege to president in 1916, while Schwab himself remained chairman of the board. The arrangement worked well. Schwab handled the public face, the deal-making, the grand strategic vision. Grace handled operations, the day-to-day management, the relentless pursuit of efficiency. Grace was a different kind of leader than Schwab. Where Schwab was gregarious and charming, Grace was formal and imperial. He arrived at the office each morning in a chauffeur-driven car. Bethlehem Steel police watched for his vehicle and signaled the office building when he approached. All the elevators would stop at the nearest floor and descend to the lobby. Grace would select whichever elevator he wanted and ride to the top in splendid isolation. Remember that elevator. We will return to it too. The 1920s were good years for Bethlehem Steel. The war had devastated European industry, eliminating competitors. American construction was booming. The company's H-beams were going into skyscrapers from coast to coast. Grace, with Schwab's backing, went on an acquisition spree. In 1922, Bethlehem purchased the Lackawanna Steel Company, gaining plants in western New York and extensive coal holdings. In 1923, the company absorbed Midvale Steel and Ordnance Company and Cambria Steel Company. By the end of the decade, Bethlehem operated 9 major steel plants and employed over 60,000 workers. The executives lived like princes. Grace's compensation became a national scandal in 1929, when it was revealed that he had received a bonus of over $1.6 million on top of his $12,000 salary. The bonus represented about 3.3% of company earnings. Stockholders sued. The case went to the Delaware Supreme Court. Grace won, but the publicity was brutal. Here was a man earning more in 1 year than his workers would earn in several lifetimes, at a company that had crushed a strike over 12-cent wages just 19 years earlier. The executives who benefited from these bonuses lived on a stretch of Prospect Avenue in Bethlehem that locals called Bonus Hill. Their mansions overlooked the city and the plant. Grace's own home at 1317 Prospect Avenue was the grandest of them all. It was a fitting address for the man who controlled the second largest steel company in America. And then, in October 1929, the stock market crashed. The crash devastated Charles Schwab personally far more than it hurt his company. Schwab had always been a speculator. He invested in mining ventures in Death Valley that turned out to be worthless. He made loans to friends and relatives that were never repaid. He spent extravagantly, maintaining his New York mansion, his 44-room summer estate in Loretto, his lifestyle of parties and gambling and display. The Depression wiped him out. By the early 1930s, Schwab was technically bankrupt. He could not afford the taxes on Riverside. Creditors circled. He offered to sell the mansion at a huge loss, but there were no buyers. Who was going to purchase a 75-room palace in the middle of the worst economic collapse in American history? Grace, to his credit, protected his mentor. The board of directors wanted to force Schwab out of the company, arguing that his personal financial troubles reflected poorly on Bethlehem Steel. Grace refused. He kept Schwab on as chairman, providing him with a salary and an office and the dignity of a title even as Schwab's fortune crumbled. Schwab spent his final years in a small apartment at the Schwab Mansion, which had been subdivided to generate rental income. He died on September 18, 1939, over $300,000 in debt. His holdings in Bethlehem Steel were virtually worthless. The man who had built one of the great industrial empires of the 20th century left behind nothing but debts. There is a bitter irony here. Had Schwab lived just a few more years, he would have seen his fortunes restored. Within months of his death, World War II began in Europe. Bethlehem Steel was about to receive the flood of orders that would make it rich again. The company that Schwab built would arm another generation of American soldiers and sailors, but Schwab himself missed it by weeks. The company, meanwhile, survived the Depression better than its founder. Steel demand fell sharply in the early 30s. Bethlehem cut its workforce, trying to keep as many workers as possible while reducing hours and wages. Grace made a decision that seemed humane at the time, but would prove consequential later. Rather than laying off workers entirely, he spread the available work among more employees, keeping them connected to the company and the pension system, even when there was not enough work to go around. And through the darkest years of the Depression, Bethlehem kept building America. If you want to understand what Bethlehem Steel meant to the American landscape, consider what the company produced in the 1930s alone. The Golden Gate Bridge, completed in 1937, used steel from 5 different Bethlehem plants. The structural sections were manufactured in Bethlehem, loaded onto rail cars, shipped to Philadelphia, loaded onto cargo ships, sent through the Panama Canal, and unloaded in San Francisco. It was a logistical triumph that matched the engineering triumph of the bridge itself. The company's chief engineer during these years, Carson Diefenderfer, liked to boast that Bethlehem Steel owned New York. It was not much of an exaggeration. The company claimed credit for 80% of the New York skyline, the Empire State Building, Rockefeller Center, the Waldorf Astoria, Madison Square Garden, the George Washington Bridge, which connected New York to New Jersey across the Hudson River, was built entirely with Bethlehem steel. 28 Liberty Street, the Chrysler Building. Though there is some historical dispute about this one. Building after building after building, all of them supported by Bethlehem H-beams, all of them monuments to the age of steel. Think about what it meant to work for a company that built these things. The steelworkers in Bethlehem could look at the skyline of the nation's greatest city and know that their labor held it up. They could drive across the Golden Gate Bridge and know that the steel beneath their wheels had been poured in their town. They could watch newsreels of the Empire State Building under construction and recognize the beams being lifted into place. There was a pride in that, a sense of participation in something larger than any individual life. That pride would sustain the workers through what came next. Because in September 1939, as Charles Schwab lay dying in his diminished circumstances, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. The world was about to need steel again, more steel than it had ever needed before. Eugene Grace received the news at the Saucon Valley Country Club, where he was playing golf with other Bethlehem Steel executives. He gathered his foursome and delivered a prediction that would prove exactly correct. "Gentlemen," Grace said, "we are about to make some money." Grace was right. World War II made Bethlehem Steel richer and more powerful than it had ever been. The company became, in the phrase that was often used, the arsenal of America. The numbers are almost impossible to grasp. Between 1941 and 1944, Grace pushed production to 101% of normal capacity. The company's 15 shipyards produced over 1,100 ships, more than any other builder in the country. In 1943 alone, Bethlehem built 380 vessels, aircraft carriers, destroyers, heavy cruisers, cargo ships, anything that floated and could carry men or material across the oceans. At one point, Bethlehem shipyards were launching more than a ship per day. This was not an assembly line producing Model T automobiles. These were enormous vessels, each one unique, each one requiring millions of man-hours of labor. The workers who built them understood that lives depended on their craftsmanship. A weld that failed, a rivet that came loose, a hull that leaked could mean American sailors drowning in cold ocean water. They took the work seriously. The company produced far more than ships. 70% of all airplane cylinder forgings used by the American military came from Bethlehem. A quarter of all warship armor plate. A third of all the big cannon forgings. The guns on the Iowa-class battleships, including the Iowa, the New Jersey, the Missouri, and the Wisconsin, were manufactured in Bethlehem. When the Missouri sailed into Tokyo Bay in September 1945 for the Japanese surrender ceremony, she carried Bethlehem Steel guns and Bethlehem Steel armor. Employment peaked at 300,000 workers. Many of them were women, taking jobs that had been reserved for men before the war. They operated drill presses and lathes. They drove cranes and operated furnaces. They did the work that needed to be done because the men who would normally have done it were fighting overseas. But even amid the patriotic fervor of wartime production, labor tensions simmered. In 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor, Bethlehem steelworkers finally won the right to union representation that had been denied them since the 1910 strike. The immediate trigger was a jurisdictional fight between the Congress of Industrial Organizations and the company's Employee Representation Plan, a company union that Grace had established to give workers a voice without giving them any actual power. The CIO's Steelworkers Organizing Committee had been signing up Bethlehem workers for years, building strength in the shadows of Grace's paternalistic system. In March 1941, the conflict came to a head. The Employee Representation Plan announced it would hold elections for collective bargaining representatives. The CIO's organizers told their 18,000 members at the Bethlehem plant that if the company union proceeded, they would strike. On March 24th, pickets appeared at the 9 gates of the Bethlehem steel plant. By 11 that night, police estimated 2,500 people were milling around the gates, pickets and onlookers together. State police arrived from across eastern and central Pennsylvania. The mayor of Bethlehem declared a state of emergency. The strike lasted only a few days. Federal mediators intervened. The National Labor Relations Board supervised an election. The workers voted for CIO representation, rejecting the company union by a significant margin. For the first time in its history, Bethlehem Steel would have to negotiate with a real union, one that the workers themselves had chosen. Grace, who had been a general manager during the union busting of 1910, was furious. He had spent his entire career fighting organized labor. When former President William Howard Taft, serving on the War Labor Board during World War I, had asked Grace whether he would negotiate with a union if 99% of his workers belonged to it, Grace had snapped back, "Not as union men." Now he had no choice. A year after the strike, the United Steelworkers of America negotiated the first union contract with Bethlehem Steel. It was the beginning of the modern era of union management relations in the steel industry. It was also, as things turned out, the beginning of the cost structure that would eventually help destroy the company. But that destruction lay decades in the future. In 1945, as the war ended, Bethlehem Steel stood at the absolute peak of its power. The company had produced over 73 million tons of steel during the war years. Almost one-third of all the armor plate and gun forgings used by the United States military had come from Bethlehem plants. The industrial capacity of Germany and Japan lay in ruins, bombed to rubble by the same American military that Bethlehem had armed. American steel producers, collectively, produced 72% of all the steel in the world. Bethlehem alone was producing 23 million tons per year. There was no meaningful foreign competition. There were no mini-mills. There was only an endless demand for steel to rebuild a shattered world and construct a new American prosperity. It must have seemed like the company would dominate forever. It must have seemed like steel would always be king. The decisions that would destroy Bethlehem Steel were made during its years of greatest triumph. This is how it often works with large organizations. The seeds of failure are planted when success seems most assured, when no one is looking for threats, when the future appears to be simply more of the present. Consider the pension decision. In the 1950s, America's two largest steelmakers faced a choice about how to fund the retirement benefits they had promised their workers. United States Steel, the largest producer, chose to fully fund its pension plan. The company set aside money each year, invested it, and built a reserve that would cover future obligations regardless of what happened to the company itself. This approach required significant cash outlays in the present, but provided security for the future. Bethlehem Steel, the second largest producer, chose a different path. The company self-funded its pensions from ongoing corporate growth. Rather than setting aside money today, Bethlehem would pay pensions tomorrow out of tomorrow's profits. This approach left more cash available for investment in the present. It assumed implicitly that the company would continue to grow and profit indefinitely. In the 1950s, with Bethlehem producing nearly 20 million tons of steel annually and earning hundreds of millions in profits, the self-funding approach seemed brilliant. Why tie up capital in pension reserves when that capital could be used to build new plants, acquire competitors, and expand market share? The growth would generate more than enough money to pay the pensions when they came due. The flaw in this reasoning would not become apparent for decades. But when growth stopped, when profits vanished, when the company started shrinking instead of expanding, the pension obligations would still be there. Workers who had been promised comfortable retirements would expect the company to honor those promises, and the money to honor them would not exist. Consider the technology decision. In 1952, a new steelmaking process was commercialized in Austria. It was called the Basic Oxygen Furnace, or BOF. The technology used pure oxygen, blown through a water-cooled lance, to convert molten iron into steel. It was dramatically faster than the open hearth furnaces that American steel companies relied upon. An open hearth furnace took 10 to 12 hours to produce a heat of steel. A basic oxygen furnace could do the same work in 40 minutes. The basic oxygen process had been developed outside the traditional big steel environment. A single Swiss engineer named Robert Dürer refined the technique. Two small steel companies in Allied-occupied Austria, still recovering from the destruction of World War II, commercialized it. These were not industry giants. They were scrappy survivors building with whatever resources they could find. American steel executives knew about the basic oxygen furnace. They studied it. They sent engineers to observe it, and they decided, for the most part, not to adopt it. The reasoning seemed sound at the time. American companies had just invested billions of dollars in open hearth capacity during the 1940s. Those furnaces were not worn out. They were producing steel profitably. Why write off perfectly functional equipment to adopt an unproven foreign technology? The first American company to install basic oxygen furnaces was McLouth Steel, a tiny producer in Michigan that accounted for less than 1% of national output. McLouth made the investment in 1954. United States Steel and Bethlehem Steel did not follow until 1964, a full decade later. During that decade, something was happening on the other side of the world. Japan and Germany, whose steel industries had been obliterated by Allied bombing, were rebuilding. But they were not rebuilding with open hearth furnaces. They were building with basic oxygen furnaces and continuous casting technology, the newest and most efficient equipment available. Their plants were being designed from scratch without the burden of legacy systems. Their workers were being trained on modern processes, without the habits of older methods. By 1970, 80% of Japanese steel was produced using basic oxygen furnaces. Japanese mills were located on coastal sites, accessible to large freighters, reducing transportation costs. Japanese steelmakers had no legacy pension obligations, no accumulated costs from decades of promises to retired workers. They could produce steel cheaper than American companies could, and the quality was at least as good. Eugene Grace retired in 1957, the peak year of Bethlehem's production. The company made over 19 million tons of steel that year and earned $190 million in profit. Grace stepped down as chairman at 81 years old, having run the company for over 40 years. He had transformed Bethlehem from a modest producer into an industrial colossus. He had navigated the Depression and the war. He had beaten back unionization for decades and then managed the relationship once the unions won. But he had also kept the company building outmoded open-hearth furnaces through the 1950s, even as German and Japanese steelmakers adopted more efficient technology. He had remained completely opposed to organized labor, fighting every advance, resisting every change. He had created an imperial management culture where information flowed up through layers of hierarchy and decisions flowed down through the same layers, slowly and cautiously. He had ridden those private elevators in splendid isolation, insulated from the shop floor, insulated from the changing world. In 1957, the year of Grace's retirement, Sputnik orbited the Earth. America responded with a crash program to build rockets and missiles and satellites. The post-war boom was at its peak. Interstate highways were being constructed across the country. Suburbs were spreading. Automobiles were rolling off assembly lines by the millions. Nobody, looking at Bethlehem Steel in that moment, would have predicted anything but continued dominance. But the seeds had been planted. The pension obligations were accumulating. The technology gap was widening. The foreign competitors were getting stronger. And in 1959, an event occurred that gave those competitors their first real foothold in the American market. The steelworkers went on strike. The 1959 steel strike lasted 116 days, the longest in the industry's history. 500,000 workers walked off the job. Steel production in America ground to a halt. American manufacturers who depended on steel had a problem. They needed material to keep their factories running. The domestic supply had vanished. They looked overseas and discovered that Japanese steelmakers were happy to fill the gap. For the first time, significant quantities of Japanese steel entered the American market. Once the relationships were established, once the supply chains were built, once American buyers learned that foreign steel could meet their needs, the imports kept coming even after the strike ended. The strike gave the Japanese a toehold. They never gave it back. Through the 1960s, import penetration grew steadily. American steel executives complained about unfair competition. They argued that Japanese producers were dumping steel at prices below their actual costs, subsidized by a government industrial policy designed to capture market share. They lobbied Washington for protection. They filed trade complaints. They demanded that something be done. There was some truth to the dumping allegations, particularly regarding European producers. But the fundamental problem was not unfair trade practices. The fundamental problem was that Japanese steel mills were simply more efficient than American mills. They used better technology. They had lower legacy costs. They were located closer to ports. They could produce steel cheaper, and increasingly, they could produce it better. Bethlehem Steel finally installed its basic oxygen furnace in 1968, 14 years after the Japanese began using the technology. The company built the new facility on a 40-acre site in South Bethlehem, in a neighborhood called Northampton Heights. Northampton Heights was a working-class community surrounded on three sides by the steel plant. The residents lived with the noise, the smoke, and the fumes from the mill. City officials had described the area as having taken on an identity of its own, an identity that was detrimental to the residents in the area and to the city. In other words, it was a poor neighborhood that nobody with power cared much about. To build the basic oxygen furnace, Bethlehem Steel demolished the entire neighborhood. 268 houses were razed. 2 churches were torn down. A city fire station was removed. Streets with names like Anthracite, Bessemer, Carbon, and Diamond disappeared from the map. St. Josaphat's Ukrainian church, where immigrants had worshipped for generations, was replaced by a furnace that produced steel almost exactly where the altar had stood. The residents received relocation assistance. Some were glad to leave a neighborhood that had been declining for years. Others mourned the loss of the community they had known. Either way, the neighborhood was gone. The company needed the land, and the company took it. The new furnace was state-of-the-art by American standards, though not by Japanese standards. It could produce 270 tons of steel at a time. It replaced the aging open-hearth furnaces that had supplied the rolling mills for decades. William Hutchinson, the plant superintendent who oversaw the facility, would later calculate that the basic oxygen furnace produced enough steel for 29 million tons of finished structural shapes over its operational lifetime. But 1968 was also the year that something else happened, something that would prove far more significant than any single furnace. In rural South Carolina, a company called Nucor Corporation opened its first steel mill. Nucor was run by a metallurgist named Kenneth Iverson. He had taken over a failing conglomerate in 1965 and reorganized it around its only profitable business, a manufacturer of steel joists. Iverson was frustrated by the high prices and unreliable service he received from the big steel companies. He decided to make his own steel. Iverson did not build a traditional integrated steel mill. He could not afford to. A conventional mill with blast furnaces and coke ovens, and the whole apparatus of ore-to-steel production, would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Iverson had access to about $6 million in bank loans, secured by everything his company owned. Instead, Iverson built a mini-mill. The concept was simple. Rather than starting with iron ore, a mini-mill started with scrap steel. The scrap was melted in an electric arc furnace, which used massive electrical currents to generate the heat needed to liquefy metal. The molten steel was then cast and rolled into finished products. Electric arc furnaces were not new. They had been used for decades to produce specialty steels. But Iverson saw something that the big steel companies missed. Electric arc technology had improved dramatically. Scrap steel was abundant and cheap. A mini-mill could produce basic steel products at costs that the integrated producers could not match. Nucor's first mill opened in Darlington, South Carolina in June 1969. The same month that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, Iverson's workers were pouring their first heat of steel. They were local people, former sharecroppers and carpenters and teachers, none of whom had ever worked in a steel mill before. When the furnace was first tapped and molten steel came flooding out, some of them were so terrified they ran from the building. Within 2 years, those same workers were among the most productive in the American steel industry. Iverson had created a compensation system based on production bonuses that rewarded efficiency. His workers were non-union, which gave the company flexibility that unionized producers lacked. His management structure was flat, with only 4 layers between the shop floor and the CEO. His overhead was minimal. The big steel companies dismissed Nucor as a nuisance. Minimills could only produce low-quality products, the executives believed. They could never compete in the high-value markets where Bethlehem made its money. They were wrong. As minimill technology improved, Nucor and its imitators moved steadily upmarket. First, they dominated the rebar and wire rod business. Then they moved into structural shapes, then into sheet steel. Each advance came at the expense of the integrated producers. Each market that the big companies ceded, thinking it was not worth defending, became a base from which the minimills launched their next attack. Through the 1970s, the American steel industry contracted. Plant closures spread. In 1977, Bethlehem laid off workers at its Lackawanna plant in western New York. The same year, Youngstown Sheet and Tube closed its Campbell Works in Ohio, eliminating 5,000 jobs in a single day. The phrase Rust Belt entered the American vocabulary, describing the industrial heartland that was bleeding jobs and population. Washington tried to help. In 1978, the Carter administration implemented a trigger price mechanism that set minimum prices for imported steel based on Japanese production costs. If imports came in below the trigger price, they would automatically face dumping investigations. The policy provided some relief, but it could not address the underlying problem of American inefficiency. In 1982, the American steel industry hit bottom. A severe recession combined with continued import pressure to create a catastrophe. Bethlehem Steel posted a loss of $1.5 billion, the largest in its history. The company suspended most of its steelmaking operations. It began laying off workers by the thousands. By 1984, Bethlehem's workforce had shrunk by almost 50% from its peak. The company sold off subsidiaries. It closed marginal facilities. It brought in professional managers who had no background in steel, hoping that fresh perspectives might save what steel experience had failed to save. The executives in their private elevators had finally noticed that the world had changed, but noticing was not the same as adapting, and for Bethlehem Steel, it was already too late. The final 2 decades of Bethlehem Steel's existence were a long, slow, grinding retreat. The company that had built America's skyscrapers and armed America's wars shrank year by year, plant by plant, worker by worker. In 1983, steelmaking was discontinued at the Lackawanna plant. In 1991, the Johnstown plant was sold through a management buyout. In 1993, Bethlehem exited the railroad car business that had been its founding purpose over a century earlier. In 1995, steel production ceased at the main Bethlehem plant. In 1997, the company abandoned shipbuilding entirely, selling off the yards that had produced 1,100 vessels during World War II. Each closure came with its own tragedy, its own group of workers suddenly cut loose, its own community struggling to adapt. The pattern was always the same. First came the rumors, then came the official announcement, then came the last day when the workers gathered to watch the final heat of steel, or the final ship launch, or whatever ceremony marked the end of that particular piece of American industry. The company tried to reinvent itself. It invested in sheet coating technology to serve the automotive industry. It sought contracts from Japanese car makers operating plants in the United States. In 1986, Bethlehem qualified as a supplier to Honda of America, learning the hard lessons of Japanese quality standards that had eluded the company for decades. "We learned from our failure," one executive admitted, "that we needed to provide better service and quality if we were to do business with the Japanese. It was not enough." The restructuring could not overcome the accumulated burdens of decades of wrong decisions. The pension obligations, accumulated through years of self-funding, hung over the company like a slow-moving catastrophe. The plants that remained were still less efficient than foreign competitors and domestic mini-mills. The market share that had been lost was not coming back. The executives who led the company through these years understood the mathematics. Every prospective buyer who looked at Bethlehem walked away because of the pension and retiree healthcare obligations. The liabilities made the company essentially unsaleable. The only way out would be to shed those obligations somehow, to find a mechanism that would allow the assets to be separated from the promises. There was also the asbestos. For decades, Bethlehem Steel had used asbestos insulation throughout its shipyards and plants. Workers had been exposed to the fibers without understanding the danger. By the 1980s, the lawsuits began. Thousands of former employees, many of them dying of mesothelioma and other asbestos-related diseases, sought compensation. The legal costs mounted into the hundreds of millions of dollars. On October 15, 2001, 5 weeks after the September 11th, attacks destroyed the World Trade Center in New York. Bethlehem Steel filed for bankruptcy. The filing came quietly, almost anticlimactically, after years of decline that had made the outcome inevitable. The company became the 25th American steelmaker to seek bankruptcy protection in the span of 4 years. Think about that date for a moment. September 11th, 2001. The attacks brought down towers in New York City. Many of those towers had been built with Bethlehem Steel. The infrastructure that terrorists targeted had been forged in the same furnaces that now stood cold and silent. The company that had armed America for 2 world wars could not survive peace. The bankruptcy process took 2 years. In December 2002, Bethlehem reached an agreement to sell its remaining assets to International Steel Group, a company created by a bankruptcy restructuring specialist named Wilbur Ross. The purchase price was $1.5 billion. Remember the Kaiser's offer of $100 million in 1915? 87 years later, after producing billions of tons of steel, after building the Golden Gate Bridge and the Empire State Building and 1,000 warships, after employing generations of American workers, the company sold for just 15 times what the German emperor had offered when Bethlehem Steel was a rising power and the world was at war. But the purchase price was not the worst part. The worst part was what was not included. International Steel Group specifically excluded the pension and retiree healthcare obligations from the deal. The bankruptcy court permitted the asset sale without the liabilities. This meant that 95,000 retirees, people who had spent their working lives at Bethlehem Steel, lost their health insurance and life insurance benefits effective March 31st, 2003. Their pensions were handed over to the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, a federal agency that insures private pension plans. The PBGC has limits on what it will pay. For younger retirees who had taken early retirement with generous pension packages, the cuts were devastating. Russell Sexton had worked at the Burns Harbor plant in Indiana for over 31 years. He retired in early 2001 with an annual pension of about $30,100. Under the PBGC limits, his pension was reduced to about $17,700. He lost nearly half of what he had been promised. "I'll probably lose my home," Sexton told a reporter. "I just went from a middle-level income to poverty level." He also lost his health insurance. Bethlehem had promised comprehensive medical coverage to its retirees. The PBGC does not cover health benefits. "They told us at our retirement meeting that something really big would have to happen to affect our pension plans," Sexton said. Something really big had happened. The company that had told him his retirement was secure had lied, or had believed its own lies, or simply had not understood what it was promising when it made those promises decades earlier. The United Steelworkers Union, which had fought so hard to organize Bethlehem in 1941, supported the sale to International Steel Group. Union President Leo Gerard called it another major stride toward the humane consolidation of the American steel industry. The word humane sat uneasily next to the reality of 100,000 people losing their health insurance. In May 2003, Bethlehem Steel Corporation was officially dissolved. The company that had existed for nearly 150 years, that had shaped the American skyline and armed the American century, ceased to exist. Its remaining assets were absorbed into International Steel Group, which was later acquired by Middle Steel, which later merged with Arcelor to become Arcelor Middle, one of the world's largest steel producers. The Bethlehem name survives only in history books and on the rusting blast furnaces that still stand where the plant once operated. If you visit Bethlehem, Pennsylvania today, you can walk among the ghosts of American industry. The Steel Stacks campus occupies 10 acres of what was once the Bethlehem Steel plant. The 5 blast furnaces have been preserved, towering monuments that reach over 230 feet into the sky. From the westernmost furnace to the easternmost, the distance spans nearly a quarter mile. At night, colored lights illuminate the structures, creating an eerie beauty that would have been unimaginable to the workers who once fed them ore and coke and limestone. The Hoover Mason trestle, which once carried raw materials from the ore yards to the furnaces, has been converted into an elevated pedestrian walkway. Visitors stroll along it, reading informational plaques about the history of steelmaking, taking photographs of industrial structures that have become tourist attractions. The Arts Quest Center hosts concerts and festivals. The Levitt Pavilion offers free outdoor performances. A PBS television station broadcasts from new studios on the site. The National Museum of Industrial History, a Smithsonian affiliate, occupies the former electrical repair shop. Exhibits tell the story of American manufacturing, including the rise and fall of Bethlehem Steel. You can see artifacts from the company's glory days, touch machinery that once shaped the nation's infrastructure, learn about the workers who operated it. And then there is the casino. Wind Creek Bethlehem, originally the Sands Casino Resort, opened in 2009 on the northern portion of the site. The casino floor echoes the industrial architecture, designed to evoke the warehouse atmosphere of the old plant. Slot machines stand where steel once flowed. Card tables occupy space that once held forging presses. Visitors can gamble away their money in a building that was purpose-built on land. where 3 generations of workers gambled with their bodies and their futures. The transformation of Bethlehem Steel into a casino and arts campus is often cited as a successful example of adaptive reuse and brownfield redevelopment. The property was saved from demolition, jobs were created, a community found a new identity after its old identity collapsed. From certain angles, it is a story of resilience and reinvention. From other angles, it is something darker. Walk a few blocks from steel stacks into the neighborhoods of South Bethlehem, and you will find a different story. More than a quarter of families on the South Side live in poverty. Over 90% of children attending South Bethlehem public schools qualify for free or reduced price lunch, which means they live at or below the federal poverty level. The casino was supposed to transform the quality of life for residents. For many of them, that transformation has not arrived. The good, high-paying jobs that Bethlehem Steel provided for a century have not been replaced with equivalent opportunities. The casino employs people, but casino jobs do not typically offer the wages and benefits that steelworker jobs once did. The service economy that has grown up around tourism and entertainment cannot support families the way the industrial economy once did. An elderly resident named Glenn Burson, who spent decades at the plant, described driving past the site every day. "Looking at a casino kills me," he said. Good high-paying jobs for the middle-class people who had gone to the shore in their ramblers and spent their money in bars, stores, and helped the economy of this great city of Bethlehem prosper. So, what do we learn from this story? What meaning can we extract from the rise and fall of Bethlehem Steel? Some will see a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency. A company that dominated its industry for decades stopped innovating, stopped adapting, stopped questioning its assumptions. It kept building open hearth furnaces when oxygen furnaces were available. It kept fighting unions when cooperation might have served better. It kept making promises about pensions that it could not keep. The lesson is that no dominance is permanent, that every success contains the seeds of future failure, that the companies which survive are those that never stop reinventing themselves. Others will see a story about globalization and its discontents, foreign competitors, rebuilt with modern technology and supported by government industrial policy, captured markets that American companies had taken for granted. Trade policies failed to protect domestic producers. Workers paid the price for decisions made by executives and governments far removed from the shop floor. The lesson is that free trade has winners and losers, and that communities built around a single industry are vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Still others will see a labor story, a tale of workers who fought for decades to organize, won that right, and then watched as the victories of collective bargaining became burdens that helped sink the company that employed them. This reading is uncomfortable because it suggests that the benefits workers fought for contributed to the collapse that destroyed those benefits. The lesson, if there is one, is that the interests of workers and the interests of companies are not always aligned, and that what seems like a victory in one moment can become a liability in another. I am not sure any single lesson captures the full tragedy of Bethlehem Steel. The story is too complex, too contingent on specific decisions at specific moments, too entangled with forces that no one person or company could control. Different decisions might have led to different outcomes, or the same decisions in different circumstances might have worked out fine. History does not offer controlled experiments. What I do know is this: something was lost when those furnaces went cold. Not just jobs, though the loss of jobs was real and devastating. Not just economic output, though. The decline of American manufacturing has had consequences that ripple through our society. Something harder to name: a way of life, a sense of purpose, a belief that hard work building tangible things could sustain a family and a community across generations. The workers who spent their lives at Bethlehem Steel built bridges that millions of people cross every day. They built buildings that define city skylines. They built ships that won wars and protected freedom across 2 oceans. They made something real, something lasting, something that exists in the physical world and will exist long after they are gone. Their grandchildren visit the blast furnaces as tourists now. They take photographs in front of industrial monuments that have been repurposed as backdrops for selfies. They do not know, most of them, what those furnaces meant to the people who worked them. They do not know what it was like to pour steel that would become the skeleton of the Empire State Building, to forge guns that would arm the ships that won the Pacific War, to be part of something that felt permanent and important and real. Jerry Green, the union leader who watched the last heat of steel at Bethlehem in 1995, said he'd never believed it could happen. He thought the company was a giant. He thought steel was king. He was wrong. Giants fall, kings are dethroned. The only constant is change, and the tragedy is that we so rarely see it coming until it has already arrived. The blast furnaces still stand in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. They will stand for a long time, preserved as monuments to an age that has passed. If you visit, look up at them. Try to imagine what it was like when they were alive, when they glowed orange against the night sky, when the men who worked them believed they were building something that would last forever. They were right about one thing. They built America. The tragedy is that they could not build a future for themselves.